I grew up in Farmerville, Louisiana, which is in the northern part of the state. It's a small town. The population was probably about 3,000 people. I was one of the first of the post-war baby boom era. My dad had been in the Army during the Second World War, and he was a little bit older, so they were anxious to start a family when he returned home. And about a year later, I came along with a lot of other young people at the time. Farmerville was a very idyllic, it was almost Mayberry. I went to school with basically the same kids from elementary school all the way through high school. I knew everyone in the community. If you're walking down the street and misbehaving, any adult in town would be likely to call you down or call your attention to it. It felt very safe and secure. Looking back, and a friend of mine, I recently went to a reunion, and he pointed this out. We probably grew up in a town that had a large percentage of African Americans, but they were basically anonymous to it. There were only two young men that I knew that were African American. One worked in a grocery store where I worked in, and another, his dad mowed our yard, and they did yard work around town. And I can remember I think while I was still in high school, I had some occasion to go into their home, and I went in the living room, and I noticed on the wall a photograph of Christ and also a photograph of John F. Kennedy. And that really struck me at the time. It was, suddenly you realize that perhaps people you've only seen in one dimension are multidimensional, and they've got concerns and hopes and aspirations like we do. So that was kind of a startling moment I remember from my childhood. My dad had an independent insurance agency, and my mom stayed home initially, but eventually she worked, and she worked in the insurance business. My dad was a very intelligent, very creative person. He was a lot of fun to be around, very extroverted, but he also had a drinking problem, so that kind of cast a shadow over a lot of my younger life. And I guess I benefited from all of the good qualities he had, but also, when children grow up in a home where alcoholism's a problem, it makes you a lot more serious and concerned, and you see the world a little more cautiously, and you perhaps are more guarded than other children are. So that had I think, a lifelong effect on me and probably my siblings too. Always appreciated men who were willing to serve as mentors for me, and that may have been something I was unconsciously missing from my dad. But our scoutmaster, Boy Scouts were a big thing in Farmerville, and I loved to go to Scouts. In hindsight, I suspect we learned a lot, and you learn a lot about growing up, working and living with other people. It's kind of one of your first experiences away from home. I remember on the first canoe trip I went on, we were tired after a long day, and Mr. Holder put his tent up, and I asked him if I should put my tent up, and he said, "I don't know, but it looks kind of cloudy to me over on the horizon." I said, like a child, "Well, should I? Yes or no, yes or no?" And he said, "A word to the wise is sufficient." Well, of course, I didn't put my tent up, and about dawn, the rain began to come. So you learn lessons of that sort that kind of stick with you all your life. And good leaders and good parents probably teach things in subtle ways. My dad had passed away when I graduated from high school, and looking back, I always thought I'd go to college, but it didn't occur to me how that would come to pass. And Mr. Downs called me to his house and sat down with me at the kitchen table with Miss Downs, and we figured out a budget about how much it would cost and that type of thing. And then he had been president of the state Masonic order, and the Masonic Home Education Fund gave me a scholarship to go to college on. My wife, Laurie, is the first assistant district attorney in Ruston, and I have 3 children. My oldest, Ann, is married to a district court judge in Thibodaux. And I have 2 Cajun grandchildren who I'm very proud of. My daughter, Adrienne, is a counselor. She lives and works in Ruston. She has 2 children. And my son, Andrew, the youngest, is a wildlife biologist, but he is now head of the the wetland restoration program for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. When I grew up, I had some exposure to LSU, but the idea of going off to LSU seemed maybe like going to Europe to go to college would now. It seemed alien, and it just, how would you do it, you know, that type of thing. And most of the people I went to school with in Farmerville went to Louisiana Tech, or what was Northeast Louisiana at the time. And I enjoyed it a lot. I had worked in the library while I was in school, and I worked during the summers and enjoyed that. I studied political science, and I graduated summa cum laude to law school at LSU, and that was one of the most enjoyable times of my life. I didn't study quite as hard, and of course it's a very competitive environment, and I wasn't at the very top of the class. I was in probably the top fifth of the class. I can remember when I was a kid to go into the courthouse at Farmerville and see the courtroom. That always looked intriguing to me, and I knew some of the men kind of secondarily that were attorneys. And so it was something I had always thought about, and it just seemed to evolve naturally without really a lot of struggle or thought. I came back to Ruston to practice law. One of the attorneys who had been grew up in Farmerville, Robert Dawkins, his dad had been the district judge in the 2nd Judicial District for a number of years, and Robert was aware that I was graduating and asked me if I'd like a job, and I came to work in Ruston at the firm he worked in. It was Barham, Wright, Barham, and Dawkins. I practiced law and worked at the beginning about 1980 at the bank until I ran for city judge in 1984. It meant everything to be in a firm where you could see from day to day how good attorneys did things, how they organized and approached things, what the pitfalls were, and that type of thing. And Robert was particularly a very good mentor, and I was lucky to have worked under him. I was elected city judge in 1984 without opposition. A friend of mine told me it meant that no one else wanted to do it, and there may have been some merit to that. The previous judge, Judge Campbell, had decided he couldn't take it anymore, that there were just too many problems. I've got the job without opposition, so I felt very lucky. In some respects, my life has been political, but I have never had to run for office against anyone. And so I've been very lucky in that respect. I volunteered for part of this because I enjoyed it, but I did all the juvenile cases in Lincoln and Union Parish on an ad hoc basis. I was appointed by the Supreme Court to do that. I enjoyed that. And we did all the criminal misdemeanors that occurred within the city of Ruston. City court's a lot different from district court at the state or the federal level. One of my mentors, Judge Fred Jones, told me he was on the Court of Appeal later, and he said going from city court to the Court of Appeal is like going from a circus to a monastery, and there's a lot of truth in that. In city court, often people are not represented. You're trying to help deal with the feelings people have, the anxieties, the anger, whatever surfaces. So you're partly an arbitrator and a diplomat, and you're trying to deal with all that and come to some fair resolution of the matter that people, if they're not happy with, will at least feel like it's something they need to tolerate. So in many respects, the city court judgeship is more challenging from a human perspective. I really enjoyed it a lot. That may have been my highest and best use. A vacancy developed in the Monroe Courthouse. Judge Melanson, who was sitting in Monroe, was from Marksville, I believe, originally, and a vacancy occurred in Lafayette, and he wanted to move closer to his home, so he moved to, you have the opportunity to change within the district, and he moved to the vacant seat in Lafayette, which left a seat in Monroe. The Senate, the way the process works on federal district judges, they are essentially selected by the U.S. senators with the approval of the White House. And on the other hand, the Court of Appeal and Supreme Court judges are nominated directly by the White House. So if you're interested in being a federal judge and there's a vacancy, you notify the two senators from your state. At the time, it was John Breaux and Mary Landrieu. I think the vacancy had occurred and been there for a while, and I hadn't really thought too much about it. And at one point, a friend of mine that was interested in politics said, well, you should consider that. And I said, well, I don't know if, if I really am qualified or have the type of experience they're looking for. He said, well, I think you might be surprised. He said they were very interested in someone that lived in this area and would move. The previous two judges had moved to other courts when they had a chance to leave Monroe. After the senators announce who they're going to nominate, then you are contacted by the Department of Justice. They appoint someone to vet your candidacy, and you go through a second vetting process. This time, though, it involves the FBI doing background checks, interviews. I think they interview hundreds of people on each nominee, and they not only go to your friends, they go to people that might not like you or people that have had negative experiences, and they try to get the full picture to help them make a decision about whether or not it's someone they want to present to Congress. And then after that, it just goes into limbo. You don't know what's going on, but then it's, I think, a couple of months later, just before the adjournment of the Senate for 1998, they did a lot of probably housekeeping matters, perfunctory matters that they had reached an agreement on out, I guess, behind the door, and a number of judges were approved at that time. Like the school prayer issue, in our area of the country, people feel strongly about that, and it's part of our community. But the law is clear, very clear, and when and I felt like my job in that case was in part to try to give the school board a chance to understand what the law was and to either accept that, or if not, at least they would know where the court was coming from. So we spent a good bit of time in mediation, trying to help mediate the differences and find some common ground that would satisfy the law and would be acceptable to the school district. We eventually weren't able to do it, and I ruled on it, and it was sustained by the Court of Appeal. And even though it might be a decision here that everyone thought that's wrong, that's not right, that's crazy, that can't be the law, when one of the attorneys told me at the Court of Appeal, the first question at the circuit level, at the Fifth Circuit level, from one of the judges, and of course, as you know, our circuit is one of the most or is probably the most conservative circuit in the country. But the first question was, how many times do we have to tell you you can't do this? So even though it felt new and it was an issue of passion to us locally, it was a well-settled legal matter. And I guess a concern, you appreciate all that, and you try to be respectful of people's feelings and their understanding, and to some extent, to the extent you can, I try to explain to people what we're doing and why, and then they may not be happy, but at least that's probably the best you can do as a judge to try to explain the reason for the decision. Whether we're judging or practicing law, we have to bring to it what we have and what we are naturally. If you're introverted, it's going to be hard to be extroverted. If you're thoughtful, it's going to be hard to be emotional about things, and vice versa. And I'm probably introverted, and I'm more of a thoughtful person that weighs things and tries to judge. I think the most important thing to me about being a judge is that on the one hand you're given a lot of power and authority, but on the other hand the expectation of a judge should be that you never abuse that power and authority, or never use it for your personal vindication or because things are an issue with you. In part, judges are perhaps like referees. The game or the contest is not about them. It shouldn't be about them. They should be the observer, the one that tries to see that the game is played fairly, and then makes decisions about when it's time to call a ball or a strike. They use their best judgment on that, knowing that sometimes you're right and sometimes you're wrong. I think, in my estimation, the most important thing for a judge is to have a level playing field, to be fair with people, to be respectful toward people, and to be kind and compassionate. It's been said I'm compassionate to a fault, although my younger brother said I was not compassionate as an older brother. But to the extent I have been able to achieve those things, that has been my goal, and I hope if I am remembered, I'm remembered for those things.